Well, good afternoon to all of you. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Keith Kiser, and I've been the headmaster here at St. Joseph's now for my 15th year. And I've been asked by Dr. Moon and the Moon children to eulogize Margaret Ann. I took my blood pressure medication this morning. I had a cup of tension tamer tea, along with some stress-free tea. I don't know if I can do this, but it's my privilege and an honor, actually, even if I don't feel worthy to do it. I've been wondering, since being asked, how does one eulogize a person of singular importance to this school community and to so many people, to me, my family, and so many friends and family members of Margaret Ann that I don't even know. My experience with her has spanned the last 15 years of her life. In those years, she and I met monthly and talked much, much more often than that. Always about her beloved school and what needed to be done to make it an even better Catholic school experience for the students. The previous 45 years of her life are known to me in story only. Those stories include her days as a Greenville high school cheerleader, where she was the beloved sweetheart of Jody, to whom she was married for nearly 40 years. She was first and foremost mom to 5 amazing kids, all of whom I've gotten to know in varying degrees through their experiences at St. Joe's, and you're going to hear from a couple of them in just a few moments. Others of you know her through her decade of service to the Junior League, or as neighbor, friend, and relative. But of course, most of us in this room know her as leader of this school through its first 2 decades. I thought what I would try to do this afternoon is paint a picture of who she was as I knew her as my boss and inspiration, by sharing with you 4 of her favorite mantras, which I heard her say repeatedly over the years in one context or another. These were her go-to statements, which expressed her deepest convictions about life and about St. Joseph's Catholic School. Whenever decisions had to be made, and she was at the helm when a lot of courageous and daring and difficult things were decided, she would often repeat one or more of these statements as the basis of what she wanted to see happen. So, number 1, she liked to talk about the leap of faith. And so for this statement, it goes like this: it might be time to take another leap of faith. Margaret Ann loved to tell the story of a meeting she had with a Baptist minister when the founders were deciding if they were prepared to open the school with just a few $100 in the bank. I know what I would have told her. Several of the founders had children who would be in 9th grade in the coming year, so it seemed like it might be the right time. But were they ready to take the plunge? She asked this Baptist minister. The minister, who started schools himself, told Margaret Ann, there comes a time when, no matter how ready you think you are, you're going to have to take that first leap of faith and go for it. Thankfully for all of us, she and her co-founders took that leap of faith. But the story of the leap of faith doesn't end there. Margaret Ann liked to say that what that Baptist minister didn't tell her was how many more leaps of faith were going to be needed to bring this new school into maturity. And I'd like to just share a few of those leaps of faith with you. Shortly after the first leap of faith to open the school, the founders and board members then realized that there was no way they were going to be able to recruit students to that little house on Augusta Road. And so they started looking for a new school building. And Margaret Ann tells the story of them finding this school that was a bad debt on the books at the bank, and they signed on a mortgage on the East Washington property. And took another leap of faith when there were 13 students in the school at the time only. Okay, I want you to hear the numbers of students that were in the school when these leaps of faith were taken. Lest you think that these leaps of faith were without anxiety, Margaret Ann tells the story that she often would stay up all night worrying about whether or not they were making the right decision, and she would look over at Joey, and he was sound asleep. Realizing that the Washington Street campus would not be the permanent home of the school. Just a few years later, she and the trustees decided that it would be wise to buy a 140,000 square foot facility on 36 acres when the school had less than 80 students enrolled. We have more faculty and staff now. A few years later, the school board, under her leadership, issued a $5 million government bond to pay off the original mortgage on this campus, and they built the high school classrooms with some of that money, all the fields, the athletic facilities, excluding the gym. That leap of faith came later. I should mention here that there were just over 100 students enrolled when the school entered into a $5 million debt. This was a courageous leap of faith. Thankfully, they did it before I got here. Under her leadership, she opened a middle school in 2003, responding to what she recognized as a need in the community. Today, that middle school educates over 250 students annually. In 2005 and 2006, the school's gymnasium was built. For Margaret Ann, the school wasn't complete without this building. She loved sports. You'd often find her in this gym cheering vigorously for the Knights. She also was instrumental in starting the football program at the school in 2008. Despite opposition from those who feared football would change the tenor of the school, and I wasn't so sure myself, it was her advocacy and support that were essential to the program being approved by the trustees. Football has changed the school, but only for the better. It's added a whole new dimension to our Christian formation of boys, and it's hard to imagine the school without our fall Friday nights at an event we call football games. A few years before stepping down the board, as board chair, due to her debilitating illness, she recommended that the school take another leap of faith by embarking on a 3-phase, $5.2 million Red Door capital campaign to build the meeting room, the kitchen, the arts floor, and 6 middle school classrooms, remove the pillars in the chapel, to renovate the chapel, and another project that's yet to be begun. Of course, a lot of thought and planning went into all of these decisions. Financial models and many ifs, ands, and buts were considered and debated vigorously before any one of these decisions were made. But in the end, all of these were gutsy calls that required taking another leap of faith. And she always said this, that they were even bigger leaps of faith because now there was more to lose if it didn't go right. These leaps were taken with a certainty that this is what God wanted and what the upstate needed. These leaps of faith required a daring, rooted in a personal experience with Christ as friend and companion. And more than anything, this is what Margaret Ann supplied for the board. Taking these leaps of faith is much easier when one believed, as she did, and this is her second go-to statement, and a core conviction of hers, that we're not doing this, God is. Through her leadership at St. Joseph's, Margaret Ann learned to be dependent upon God. There's a story from the early years of the school that illustrates this reliance. The school's first headmaster, Sandy Greaves, who's here today, who's really, in many ways, the hero of the first 7 or 8 years of the school, permitted a family to enroll even though the family had no means to pay tuition, and the financial aid well, however small it was originally, was dry. When Sandy told Margaret Ann what she had done, Margaret Ann accepted the decision, saying that God would provide. And it wasn't too long after that somebody did. Margaret Ann was dependent on God because she knew her limitations. She never thought she had it all figured out, and she never pretended she knew how to perfectly run the Catholic school, nor did she think she was beyond making a mistake. In fact, she knew she didn't have all the answers and that it was okay, because in her mind, the success of the school didn't depend on her doing everything correctly. It depended, in her estimation, on being faithful to God's will, as best she and the trustees could understand it in the present circumstances. Margaret Ann judged things by a different logic than most of us. In a world that esteems the independent, the self-made, powerful man or woman, she judged reality by the logic of the gospel. Instead of using power and force to get what she wanted, she sought to serve others, relying on God to provide. She used to say to me, "God has a lot of money, Keith, and if he thinks we need it, someone will step forward." Margaret Ann was a child of God. There was an intelligent simplicity about her. She reasoned this way: if God asked her to do this, he would provide the means necessary. One thing she feared more than anything else was that the school in time, because we had grown up, would change this logic and begin to depend upon our own intelligence and resources. She saw this as a potential death knell of the school's mission, because running the school would no longer thrust us into a dependent relationship with God, but rather a maintenance mode, and that dynamism with the relationship with God would change. Her third go-to statement was, and she said this to me often, "Do what is best for the students. We've got to," I'm quoting her now. She said to me multiple times, "Put the students and their needs first, particularly their spiritual needs." By putting the students' needs first, she didn't mean this in a sentimental way, nor did she think that we should attend to every whim or gratify their selfish desires. That's not what she meant. Rather, she believed that one day she would answer to God for how well the students in her school were educated in the Catholic faith. I mentioned earlier that she and I talked often. In those conversations, often over lunch, I shared with her what was going on in the school and what I was concerned about. She just listened, asked a few questions. Usually there were one or two matters of a more difficult nature which I would seek her opinion about, and ask for her to tell me what she thought the best course of action was. Staggeringly, she never once told me what she thought I should do. Never once. She would simply say, "Do whatever you think is in the best interest of the students, even if it might be a difficult decision in the moment. I trust you, I'll support your decision," and she always did. I leave these lunches from time to time in a state of agitation, thinking, I wish she would just tell me what she wanted me to do. But she never did. She knew how important it was for me to grow in discernment, prayer, and confidence. In reflecting on these conversations, it was like I was talking to Mary, our Blessed Mother. Margaret Ann would just listen. She'd help me sort it all out based upon what was best for the students. These were extraordinary encounters that I will never forget. When I was worked up or complaining about something or someone, she never once joined in by adding insult to injury. Oh, how I wish she would on some days, just to make me feel good. She just listened. Through her silence, I often heard how ridiculous I sounded, and it brought me back to the mission of the school and doing what was best for students. In retrospect, I think about these conversations as if they were moments of prayer that brought me back to perspective, and the right course of action became much clearer. After one of these conversations, I would often feel ashamed of my paltry outlook and complaints. Not because she ever corrected me, but simply because her heart was just so big. Which brings me to the fourth and final of her mantras. She said, "Our graduates are destined to change the world." She believed, as she said so often to me, the Holy Spirit is preparing our graduates to renew the face of the earth. For emphasis, she would add, and that's what I really believe. It was important to Margaret Ann that our students not be educated in a Catholic bubble that would isolate them from the rest of the community. For how would we do any good if we were separated from it? She always said that St. Joseph's was here for the community. The education of our students should prepare them to engage in the life of the community as mothers, fathers, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, civil servants, businessmen, craftsmen, artists, actors, athletes. She wanted our graduates in every field. Why? In order to be salt that leavens the dough, yeast that leavens the dough, and light that enlightens the darkness, through being beacons of beauty, hope, justice, truth, and most of all, charity, just as she was filled with these things. Her vision of the school was always ecumenical, without diminishing or compromising our Catholic teaching. She wanted St. Joe's to be a place where Catholic, Protestant, and non-Christian could be in dialogue and meet in friendship. She had great affection for the many non-Catholic ministers and churches who reached out to help the school. It's not insignificant that the school's first home was on a campus of a Lutheran church. God knew what he was doing. She went to her grave filled with gratitude and affection for Reverend Miles and his congregation for opening the red door to the school. She talked to me about how difficult it was growing up Catholic in the South. She said there were so many misunderstandings about Catholics and what we believed. She hoped that our graduates, as they became more numerous and involved in the community, would help clear those misunderstandings up. I was thinking about her saying this to me during Roger Klingscale's funeral at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Roger, a non-Catholic with a Catholic wife and Catholic children, served on our school board for years, and before that, he was involved with St. Mary's Catholic School. St. Mary's Catholic Church was filled with Roger's Protestant and Catholic friends, many of whom were associated with St. Joseph's. It was extraordinary, to say the least. The whole time I kept thinking, Margaret Ann would have loved this and seen it as a sign of the school's mission at work. In closing, I'm going to dare an attempt at summarizing the significance of Margaret Ann's extraordinary life. The method God uses throughout history to communicate his gifts to people is one which we can call preference. In other words, he chooses particular people, showers them with his graces, and then calls them to a particular work in order to reach the rest of us. Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, St. John the Baptist, St. Peter, and the apostles, St. Paul, St. Augustine, St. Benedict, St. Scholastica, St. Francis, St. Clare, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Catherine, St. Francis Xavier, St. Therese of the Little Child, one of her favorites, St. Padre Pio, St. John Paul II, to name just some of the well-known. Not to mention the thousands of others known to only those inside their communities and families. I think that Margaret Ann is one of God's preferred, one of his chosen ones, not for her own sake alone, but for the rest of us. A few years ago, Margaret Ann told me a story. She said she had only told to Joby and a handful of others. She had been praying, asking God, now what? God had granted her 40 amazing years, but she had the sense that he was asking something of her, but what was it? Margaret Ann said that she heard a voice as plain as I'm speaking to you today. I want you to start a Catholic high school in Greenville. This has not been something that was on her mind. It came somewhat out of the blue. Look around the room this afternoon at what has been generated through Margaret Ann's yes to that call. Answering God's call was never a cakewalk for her. It wasn't a pet project to improve her social standing. It cost her tremendously. She was well aware that doing great things for God typically involved great suffering. She invested her entire self into this school. These 20 years were difficult yet joy-filled years. She'd be the first to tell you that she and the school made many mistakes along the way. God certainly had to write straight with crooked lines, but that's what God does. But think about how many of us have been profoundly impacted in one way or another by this school community. How many of us would not know one another, and how much less would our lives be without this amazing school and this extraordinary woman. Many young people today wonder about the relevance of faith to life's real needs. In fact, far too many leave the faith because they sadly reduce being a Christian to a list of beliefs and rules to follow. Margaret Ann showed us that Christianity is much more, that it is first and foremost a relationship with Jesus, who we encounter continually in his church. A couple of days ago, a few of us were standing around with Jody when Bart McGrath asked Jody, was there ever a time when you and Margaret Ann looked at what you were doing and said, why did we get ourselves into this mess? His response was an immediate and resounding no. He said that in fact, a month or so ago, when he and Margaret Ann were reviewing their lives together, they said to one another, it's been one heck of a grand adventure, a life fully lived. Margaret Ann would not want us to go home today saying that. She would not want us to go home saying, what a great lady. She'd want us to leave here and wonder at how great and good God is. She'd want us to marvel at all that God continues to do in the world, and that the church is alive and as relevant to man's needs today as it ever was. Her life and what it continues to generate is a testimony to Jesus' promise that those who follow him will experience fullness in this life and in the next. May you rest in peace, Margaret.